And today we are going to be looking at the topic of energy islands. And so we've got a small room here and we've got lots of people watching online. So the concept of energy islands was introduced to the world, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. And it seems simple enough. There seems to be lots of offshore wind generation, and there seems to be lots of clustering of offshore wind parks around the globe. So why not make an energy island, either an actual island or a man-made island, to capitalize on some of these advantages? And so this panel will take a look at some of those advantages and what this is going to mean to the world. It's also going to look at regional collaboration. So what does it take for governments to work together to actually enable the framework to make this happen? Our first panelist today is Joachim Belker, who is the head of unit for the European Commission DG Energy. Joachim is going to give a brief overview about what's been done at the EU level, and then I'll ask Joachim a couple of questions about the Espia Declaration. But Joachim, I'll hand the floor to you to give your presentation. So the floor is yours now.
Thanks very much, Alex. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, depending on from where you're listening. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel today to discuss the merits of offshore wind and energy island projects in particular. I think it's an excellent occasion to do so, and it's a very good context to do that also in an event organized by the Global Wind Energy Council, because I do believe that this is a topic which merits global attention. I do first of all hope that you can hear and see me well. If not, please do let me know. Otherwise, I'll give you a few introductory remarks to summarize, but really very briefly, what we've been doing on the Commission side over the last couple of years, really to promote offshore wind, and more particularly to promote cooperation on offshore wind projects, which we do think is going to be an integral part of our wider climate agenda. And it is going to be a wider part of the more immediate need, perhaps, to avail ourselves, particularly in Europe, of our dependency on fossil fuel imports, actually in the rather short term. So we do have a consensus here in Europe that developing wind and offshore wind in particular is going to be a cornerstone of replacing this fossil fuel import dependence, which still exists today and which is certainly a source of vulnerability in Europe. And the reason that offshore wind is so important in that context is threefold. First of all, because of the enormous potential that this technology has all over Europe, I should say. The development so far is rather asymmetric, I would say, so it's much more advanced in Europe's northern parts, but we do believe that the potential exists in all parts of Europe, and that's what we want to push. Secondly, because of the cost effectiveness of the technology, now cost-effective energy supply is more important than ever. And if you look at the costs of developing offshore wind, the costs of generating electricity from offshore wind, it's gone down so significantly over the last decade, really, that this is one of the core advantages of the technology today. And thirdly, because of the nature of the technology, which actually makes it legally, because it is one comes about the price and comes about very high load factors. We believe that more elements facing like state. And one remark on that is look at what has happened over the last years. See that all the players that actually started to compete for the grid offshore independent in Europe, because they have that's going to be that honest now. We devised our strategy on this, published it in with the offshore strategy, and what we did at the time is we set out rather ambitious targets in terms of the capacity that we want to see in our waters, 60 gigawatts in 2030 and 300 gigawatts in 2050. Now, these targets are certainly ambitious, but if we look at the kind of commitments that we've seen from member states over the last years, over the last weeks and months, really, we see that those ambitions actually have already surpassed what we proposed in 2020, in particular in the 2030 perspective, where we have had very recently two summits, which I'm sure we're going to touch upon again in the course of the session, on the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea, both organized by Denmark, where leaders of the relevant countries committed to offshore commitments. And only for those two sea basins, we are already surpassing the number of 60 gigawatts in 2030. So we do have to revise our ambitions upwards there. On the other hand, these are ambitions. If we look at the rollout rates, the installation rates that we see annually today, these are not yet in line with those ambitions. Quite to the contrary, they probably have been around about double. And this is the main reason why the cornerstone of what we proposed in our offshore strategy is really a change in approach, a change to put much more emphasis on cooperation in building out the solution capacity. And I think it is in this context of reinforced regional cooperation that projects such as the energy islands that we're going to discuss today are really at the forefront of what we need to do. Such cooperation projects are necessary to minimize costs and to minimize the amount of resources that are necessary to get that capacity out there, but also in order to be able to maintain efficient use of the maritime space that we're talking about, because that space is also limited, and the amount of capacity that we need to fit in that space is quite significant. So these cooperation projects, such as the energy islands, which are the topic of our discussion today, are absolutely crucial. Now, how do we want to incentivize such cooperation? Basically, we foresee two steps that are also enshrined in our legislation that is enforced today in the regulation of trans-European networks that we are implementing. First of all, we would like member states in all European sea basins to agree on common goals on how much offshore renewable wind they want to build out until 2030, but also perspective to 2040 and 50. And secondly, on the basis of this, what we want to devise together with the network operators is some kind of common regional level grid planning, strategic offshore grid development plans, which would give visibility for project promoters on the capacity that is expected to come on, and in particular also to grid operators and investors, project promoters for grid projects, to see what is the grid that is going to be necessary to connect all this offshore capacity, because that is going to be one of the crucial factors to ensure that the grid comes on time to be able to use that capacity. Now, as I said, the core element for us as Commission, where we also see our strongest role, is in fostering that cooperation between member states, between operators. We do want to foster that cooperation both in terms of system planning, this is the grid plan that I just mentioned, but we also want to foster that cooperation, that's the other dimension, in terms of industrial development, in terms of creating a supply chain in Europe which has the necessary size to deliver those elements. This is what we're doing, for example, through the work of the Clean Energy Industrial Forum. This is what I wanted to say in a nutshell by way of introduction. So really, where we see our core role as European Commission in fostering that cooperation in between the member states in Europe to make that offshore ambition come about. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, and for those remarks. While we have you on the screen, I would like to pose a couple of questions to you, if that's okay, and then we can move on to our next panelist and our presentation. One of the questions is that you mentioned it briefly about the Estia Declaration, which was signed back in May, and also the Baltic Declaration. These are examples of regional collaboration that actually help foster a greater
I'm sorry, Alex, I don't understand the qualities are probably not very good. Right, difficulties in understanding the questions.
Sorry, is this better for understanding the questions?
There's a bit of an echo, but let's try.
Yeah, so what I was asking you is that you mentioned in passing about the Espia Declaration, which was signed back in May of this year. You okay with me? You following the question so far?
I'm sorry, I didn't manage to catch that question.
Then we'll get back to those questions. So we'll actually we'll move on with the presentation. So thank you very much. We'll keep you on the line so you can hopefully hear what's happening in the rest of the panel. We'll move on to our second presenter of the day. So I'd like to introduce to the stage, actually before we introduce our next presentation, we have a video that kind of sets the scene that I'd like to play. This is, again, around energy islands, and this is produced by Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. Well, thank you very much for sharing that video with us, Thomas. That's quite an impressive ambition you have there. I'd like to introduce Thomas Belsgaard, who's a partner with the Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. Thomas, can you please give us your remarks in relation to energy islands?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for coming to this session today. You saw sort of the basic concepts here on the video. Energy islands is not sort of about the island itself. The island is more a vehicle to really ramp up offshore wind energy. You know, today we will typically tender out 1 gigawatt at a time. if we are to reach the goals that the Commission mentioned and that the countries in the EU, for instance, has agreed upon, we need to scale that to 10 gigawatts per project, basically. And this is where the island comes in, because the island is basically a hub that actually collects and gathers the wind from, say, 5 to 10 gigawatts, and then turns it, distributed across markets and also across sectors. Because we're big believers in hydrogen production offshore on the islands. It will save a lot of money on cabling, on HVDC transmission lines, if you can actually convert the power or a chunk of it into hydrogen on the island and transfer that in a hydrogen pipe to Rotterdam or to Esbjerg or wherever on the coast. That also alleviates some of the grid congestion challenges that the Commission was mentioning, because you'll have a much easier integration into the grid if you can actually switch between hydrogen and power production. Huge automation opportunities, so you also get a more valuable product mix. And I would say that given the political ambitions, but also given the geopolitical circumstances we are in at the moment, with the war in Ukraine, with Russian gas being cut off, with all countries want to be much more energy independent, have energy security, the energy islands are as pertinent as ever. And again, it's not about the island itself. The island is a quite small portion. It's less than 5% of the total capex of the total project. So we believe it's going to create a lot of value. We also recognize, as the that this is, of course, something that is also have an international dimension. So it's very good that the Commission mentioned that they would like to engage on and can work together to make interconnectors. But I think it's also very important to say that we believe that this can be a developer-led effort, where offshore wind has reached grid parity. Power to X or hydrogen electrolyzers are now being commercialized large scale. So this is not a project that needs government support. So basically it's something that we can do on a commercial and financially independent way. So I think it's also really important to rethink the role of the government in this, and so we can actually do this developer-led, of course given some overall framework set by the government, but it's not, the subsidies are not needed for this. So that's also very important. And then my last point is, in the North Sea we have shown that you can actually build artificial islands because the water is rather shallow. In other parts of the world, the concept of the hub and the mega scale is just as important. So in Asia, for instance, it's just as important. But of course, if you have a 1,000-meter deep water, you cannot build an artificial island. But there are plenty of existing islands applied for the same purpose. So it's not so much about building an island; it's more about creating space and being able to do these very large scale projects in densely developed areas. There you need to go out where there's fewer. Of course, still being mindful about environmental concerns, defense, not least these days. Actually, the island can also be used for that, in that context, fisheries, shipping routes, and so forth. So we are working on 2 projects in Denmark. One is already being tendered out. It's a state-led, government-led effort. We also have proposed a development-led island in the Danish shelf. We have 2 handfuls of other projects around the world. So we see this as a trend that is growing, and where many governments, when we explain the concept, they say, yes, this is something that we need. For instance, take Japan, an energy island 120 kilometers out of Tokyo can cover maybe 1/5, maybe 1/4 of the total energy need in Tokyo. This is something that matters. This is something that actually moves the needle and that the government needs. I think I'll pause it there.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That's fascinating to get your perspective. I'll ask you to stay on the stage now as I call the rest of the panelists up. I just need to bring your chairs out so you've got somewhere to sit.
Where do you go?
So, thank you. So our first... So, introducing the panelists one by one, we have Alexandra Malone, from the Director of Corporate Affairs at SSE Renewables. We have, so please welcome Alexandra. Thank you. We have Al-Karim Gavinji from the Global Head of Public Affairs at DNV. Welcome, Al-Karim. And then welcome back, Thomas. Thank you very much. So I'll start with you, Alexandra. The CIP are all in on energy islands. SSE just as buoyant or just as bullish today. Do you see these as revolutionary that's going to change the world of offshore wind forever?
So CIP is definitely leading the way. SSE Renewables sees energy islands as having that huge amount of potential that Thomas was speaking about earlier. We are currently developing the world's largest wind farm at Dogger Bank, which actually shares a lot of the similar features as the energy island that we saw in the video. It's over 130 kilometers off the northeast coast of England, and it's going to have 277 wind turbines, capacity of 3.6 gigawatts. So you can see Dogger Bank as being sort of a similar concept, but we need to add on some of the other features, such as green hydrogen, and some of the other particular features that we could have there.
Thanks. Al-Karim, what about DNV? How are you guys seeing this technological breakthrough? Is it going to be a game changer?
I think it certainly could be a game changer, but I think, as Thomas said earlier, you need to make sure you use it in the right conditions, right? It's not a sake of having an island for the sake of it. Many of the elements need to be there. You need to have certain conditions in terms of the scale you need, in terms of the louder, better, in terms of the need in multiple markets, because you've got interconnectors going in from the island into other countries, and you need the right geodynamic and hydro conditions to enable it to work. And of course you need the cooperation of a number of countries to enable that, the interconnectors to be interoperable and to then connect into the grids and the right onshore grid infrastructure to happen. So I think there's lots of potential there, but mindful that you need to do it in the right way. I think the other thing I'd say is there's a timing issue here, right? Some of these islands can take a very long time to build, right? Now the scale of them, of course, is huge, and so in terms of enabling the energy transition, they can go a very long way. The question is, some of these islands could take 10 years to come to fruition. And so we also need to bear in mind that we have to continue to do the other things that we do that we know well that can be done today in terms of the traditional offshore wind farms, of course, to enable the two things to happen in parallel.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. One of the things that I wanted to ask Joachim, who was on the panel, or who called in, was about the Esbjerg Declaration and the Baltic Sea Declaration, and the amount of government and collaboration that's needed to develop these islands. So, Thomas, to you, are you seeing that, when the Esbjerg Declaration was signed, there was a lot of talk about that it would be used to accelerate permitting and used to accelerate or to bring in more EU finance to these projects. Are you seeing that in reality? And do you need regional collaboration for the energy islands to fly?
So at least in our part of the world, makes a ton of sense to have the interconnectors between, for instance, Denmark, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Norway, UK, and so forth. You can say in other markets, for instance, Japan, we don't have the same need, of course, be the case in Korea and stuff like that. They actually have so much internal need that you can have this just into one market. The Esbjerg Declaration, the Baltic Sea Declaration were great. The irony right now is that the political ambitions are where they should be, extremely ambitious. The industry is there, we have the projects, we have the financing. So it's more in the machine room, how do you get it going? And I actually want to challenge a little bit. I'm not saying that we should not do Dogger Bank and sort of normal wind farms, but we should do it in parallel. And it doesn't take longer to construct an island project than to construct an offshore wind project. But of course, if you want to construct 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, you probably will do that in phases. But the island takes 3 years, and you'll do that together with the first 4 gigawatts. So the island is not going to be a sort of a time barrier for this. But of course you'll build the island sufficiently large to accommodate 10 gigawatts and then just start with the 3. That's all part of the business case. That's all something that can be accommodated. So I think the political ambitions are there. We are there. We need sort of getting that permitting. So we have the 3 Ps. We need pace, predictability, and permitting. This is what it's all about right now. And the question is, how can you, across governments, agree on a joint approach? I think that's more difficult because this is very much national competencies. So a big challenge there for the individual countries as well. Yeah, in the supply chain session yesterday, we talked about there should be, if you have targets, they should come with a permit attached to those targets. So permitted targeting is something that the industry would definitely require. Elkarim, coming back to you and DNV, we see in the North Sea, if you look at sort of like the standards that are available, like standardisation in the North Sea, agreeing on standards, it's different from country to country. Denmark requires something, Germany requires something else. We're talking about energy islands. How do we marry all of these different standards up, and is it going to be a nightmare? And I'd also like to get your input into how can we accelerate the permitting process in some of these areas?
Yeah, it's definitely a big issue in terms of standards because we don't have standards for everything. But some of the things that are being considered and being dealt with in some of these islands, there are a series of things. So one is around safety assurance. So continuous assurance of the safety aspects and thinking about how you do that. I think that's important to replicate in other islands that we create. The second thing is around standards. You mentioned, for example, concrete structures. We can leverage some of the capability that we have in the that has lots of concrete structures and bring that to bear here. And the other thing is around verification. So things around geodynamics and other elements around those things. Again, some of these things are being looked at through workshopping and doing risk management approaches to these things. In terms of other sort of certification services, more traditionally in offshore wind, you're absolutely right that each market often needs its own set of guidance. So I know we work very hard at DNV to get into the Korean market, to look at how the certification process can work, how we can leverage some of the capabilities we've got in Europe and use some of those verification services or certification services. So that's phenomenally important. I think your next question was around permitting. This has been an age-old thing, and of course Repower has done a lot in the EU to try and fast-track some of this stuff, more so I guess for the onshore part, in terms of these acceleration zones as they're calling them, where you can have pre-permitting done. But I think Denmark has had challenges around permitting. I think there has been issues and challenges, and this is where I think the municipalities need to ease the process. And I think potentially in Belgium, maybe with the Elia Island, maybe the permitting process has been a little bit simpler. Maybe there's been a little bit faster movement there, but it's a general problem that does need to be addressed by the EU and others.
And you know what's kind of made that faster? I'll come to you in a second, Saka. Do you know what made that faster? What did they do right in that area?
When we spoke to the CEO of Elia, he just said, look, we took a very pragmatic approach, right? We didn't sort of go through every hoop. We didn't try and consult with every single entity. We, of course, consulted with the key entities, but trying to kind of simplify and take a pragmatic approach where you can, enable them to try and get these things done much faster.
Okay. Alexander.
Just wanted to jump in on the accelerating permitting. One of the advantages of the energy island concept is the predictability. So if it's known that the ambition for the energy island is 10 gigawatts, then that gives an advantage from an environmental permitting perspective because that's known. Cumulative impacts can be looked at from the beginning, and also from an infrastructure perspective, it allows that infrastructure to be developed in a more efficient way. So, for example, I think you mentioned some of the grid challenges, or maybe it was mentioned by the EU, and that can really help by having more efficient onshoring of that infrastructure, having some of it offshore and having maybe single points of contact coming in, because definitely in the UK and other jurisdictions there is already starting to see some pushback on offshore infrastructure coming onshore.
Sorry, and just further into that, do you expect to see, like if you mentioned that the island was only a small portion of this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an island in some jurisdictions. When it is an island, do you see that, are you expecting any unique challenges around the island concept rather than just having a whole lot of connected offshore wind parks? Is there anything unique about an island concept rather than just offshore permitting?
I think it would take, there's probably some different, that you mentioned some of the safety concerns, and if you're having people out there on the islands, which would differ from some of the platform concepts that we have of people, SOVs and operators coming across. I'm sure there would be some unique challenges.
Yeah, Thomas, I saw on the film, it looked like you have thousands of tourists each year flying into the island and enjoying the walk around the rough seas.
Yeah, that's nice, isn't it? And I think, the whole thinking is that we need to get beyond the traditional point-to-point connection, because if you want to put up 300 megawatts of offshore wind just in the EU, it's going to drown in transmission costs. That's for sure. So you need to do something differently. So the whole point about the island is you can save a lot of money on HVDC transmission and conversion by connecting markets, and then combining it with the electrolyzers. You will have a much higher utilization, capacity utilization in your HVDC cables. You can reduce the size of them, and then you can transform some of it into hydrogen, which is much cheaper to transport. It only costs 1/5 of the cost transporting energy through a hydrogen pipe than through an HVDC connection. So it's a matter of saving cost, getting a better product mix, power when the power price is high, hydrogen when the power price is low, and that is what creates the value of this. So we cannot just continue and say, why don't you just build 300 gigawatts point-to-point connections? And the alternative is, of course, that you do jacket solutions, where you put the converters up on a jacket, as you do on Dogger Bank. It's fine, it works, but it's a one-trick pony. You cannot do anything else than conversion. The island is a multifaceted, it's a Swiss knife, can do different things that you can optimize on.
Sure, and so does that mean that in terms of like direct electrification and the hydrification or gasification, like are you focusing more on actually producing hydrogen that you will then convert back into electricity and using it as a grid stabilizer, or what are you going to do with the hydrogen?
So we believe that hydrogen is going to have its own. There will be a need for green hydrogen to replace a lot of the fossil natural gas that we are using today. So of course there's a huge need for direct electrification. The islands can also provide power for that, but there's also a huge need for green molecules from electrolyzers, which is going to be used in heavy industries, heavy transportation, for methanol, for sustainable aviation fuels and so forth, where it's not going to be put back into electrons, because of course that's a pretty damn expensive conversion. Let me say on the people side, by the way, so the alternative is to have people, the O&M crews staying on the island, is of course that they will be there on big ships. So there's a huge O&M cost savings. On the Dogger Bank, the cost of these SOVs that I have to be there 24/7, huge cost that you can save by having the service harbor at the island, and much more nice for the people living there.
Yeah, it certainly seems to make offshore wind farms that are very far from shore, all of a sudden they're near shore wind parks, which makes it a whole lot of difference in their serviceability. Elke, in terms of how are you seeing the hydrogen versus electrification prospect coming out of this? Because that's an interesting point. I mean, we need a lot of offshore wind power to go into direct electrification. And I mean, if it's going to be additionality for hydrogen, that's great. But how are you seeing, or how's DNV seeing the split here?
No, I totally agree. I think it provides you with an added level of flexibility that a traditional wind farm doesn't give you, right? And the ability to then use the electricity when the prices are typically far lower or negative in many cases, and to use that to convert the hydrogen, or to produce the hydrogen, and then to, as you say, potentially pipe it down to the various countries that need it. So I think that modularity, the additional aspect of the energy islands, to have the space to be able to do that and use hydrogen in that way, makes perfect sense. I think the challenge, and this is not necessarily a challenge for the energy island specifically, but more so for hydrogen, you need that business model, right, in terms of the offtake, right, and that's complex, and so we'll have to think about the different business models of how that's going to work, but I don't think that's a unique feature necessarily of an island.
Thank you.
Just on power to X, I think the energy island concept also gives you the flexibility to look at places where wind speeds are high and water depths are small, but perhaps there isn't a demand center. So you could have a power to X play in a jurisdiction like that.
Are you considering like power to X also as the part of the Dogger Bank project? Is that part of that project?
It's not part of the current Dogger Bank ABC, is all I'll say.
Okay, we can read whatever into that as we like. So, all right, we've heard how wonderful all of this is, and we've heard how it's going to revolutionise things and all the benefit it's going to bring. What are the greatest challenges that you expect to see in this space? And we'll start with you, Alexandra. Are you seeing anything, any red lights flashing anywhere that we need to sort before we can actually steam ahead here?
I think it's similar to what Thomas was saying earlier. The private sector, we have the solutions. It's a commercial opportunity. We could make it happen, but we do need the political support. We need the government support to be able to, all the different agencies who need to come together. So, for example, in the UK, from a seabed leasing perspective, that would all have to be aligned around an energy island concept in order for different companies to be able to bid on seabed.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Thomas?
No, I totally concur with that. That is probably the biggest challenge. From a sort of implementation point of view, it's not a new technology. You said it's not a new technology. It's a new concept using existing technologies. So it is actually doable, but of course it's complicated. It's a big project, right? So you need to manage that well. But we are used to doing that. You have done it on Dogger Bank. We have done it many places all over the world. I would say one thing that where we need to really work is also on the sort of environmental biodiversity angle to it, because we need to make sure that society understand that this is not going to be disruptive to the marine environment where we place it and stuff like that. So there's a big sort of communication challenge. We believe there are many good solutions. We have good dialogues with the NGOs and the nature conservatory organizations around how to actually make this an environmental plus project where you can have actually more diversity, because we create natural reefs and all that. But there will be a sort of a communication challenge towards society that this is not something that they need to be afraid of, but it's something that can actually give the green transformation without having to grow up with the big turbines just in your backyards.
Thanks, Alkarim.
Yeah, I mean, I think ensuring that you have sufficient onshore grid capacity to take all of this on, so in the various countries, of course, is a huge challenge. And we know every country needs to potentially double the scale of its grid infrastructure. So I think it's no point having that scale if you don't have that infrastructure on land to be able to take that into the markets that you need to go into. So I think that's huge thing to consider. A kind of maybe a general, slightly controversial topic might be around wind resource itself. Now this is not an island specific thing, it's about offshore wind. We know that wind speeds are high when the differential between the polar temperatures and the equatorial temperatures are high. That gives you the higher wind speed. Those temperatures have been narrowing. So we saw in 2021 as an example, wind speeds in Europe were significantly lower than many other markets, okay, 10% lower. And the UK, in fact, had a 20% reduction, so typical wind speeds of around 14.5 kilometers per hour became 11.5. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to happen every year, but there is volatility in that. So that's an issue in terms of the economics of it. And I think Thomas's team will work much harder on and know much more about that in terms of net present value of those projects. But I think that's something that needs to be thought about in general, how we're dealing with that volatility of wind speeds year by year.
Okay, thank you. We're almost sort of running out of time here, but I'd like to hear your perspective about the timelines of this, and maybe as a closing remark, a few words about what you see as the future and how long you expect this to be realised. And we'll start with you, Alexandra.
Sure. So we're seeing typical time frames to develop an offshore wind farm now, say 1, 2, 3 gigawatts of nearly 10 years. That's in the UK and I think elsewhere as well. We definitely need to see that permitting process accelerated, because it's not the construction time that's holding us back, it's the permitting time. So if we're looking ahead to doing mega projects like Energy Islands, we really need to be able to see government accelerating that permitting process and letting us getting on with the building part.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was also another point yesterday where people said it actually takes you much longer to get a project permitted than it does to build it. I mean, that's just crazy. It's just really backwards thinking.
No, again, I of course agree, and I think we can actually cut that basically in half. I think because technically you can do the environmental impact assessments plus the detailed engineering at the same time, the seabed and all that. You can do the construction in say 3 years, and then you'll have the first at least 3 gigawatts up and running plus the island. So we just have we have the Belgium island, of course, which will be there in 2026, 27. I think the Ely Island. It's a bit smaller, but it is the concept. We just had the tender out for the Danish state-led island in the North Sea. They contemplate that first power will be in 2033, which is 11 years down the road. And I'm just saying that in these times, with the need that we have and the challenge, why does it take 11 years to get that going? But that's because the tendering process, there will only be award in 25, end of 25, which is more than 3 years out. So just saying why. So that's why we also propose the developer-led and try to say that there's also an alternative. So why don't we do, because in Denmark, Danish waters, we need more than one. Let's do another one that is developer-led, and let's try and see the time of that. We believe we can get first power on that prior to the first island, so maybe 2029, 2030.
Yeah, this is why we have clever developers jumping on the open door policy from Denmark, so well done on that. El Karim, yourself, how about the timeline for DNV? How do you guys see this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know that some of these things do take time, and you've mentioned, Alexandra, the permitting challenges which continue to be there, which seems to be really stymieing the whole development of the market, not just for energy islands, but for many other technologies. So I think bringing that faster, being pragmatic about how we do it, giving municipalities the power to make change rather than having it all centralized, I think will hopefully try and drive action.
Thank you very much then. So I'd like to open up the floor now. If anyone has any questions from the floor. For those of you watching online, there's thousands of hands in the room that have all just gone up at once. So I'm just trying to decide who to pick. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. If you can, one brave soul. Thank you very much.
I didn't want to leave you hanging. Hi. Afternoon, Rachel Terry Van Noord. We're one of the contractors who work in the offshore wind space. And what we see happening in the European market is a big shift to nature positive offshore wind. So are we not really missing an opportunity here with this energy island to really sell it as a nature positive outlook? And you touched on it, Thomas, but I really missed it actually from the whole discussion. If you're also talking about permitting, the biodiversity discussion will become the clincher in actually getting permits for these kind of offshore, whether it be a structure or an island. And I agree it's not new technology, but we really need to address how we're going to make this biodiversity positive.
I can give it a first shot, and then I fully agree. I think it's a brilliant point, and what I said about our dialogue with the NGOs, we had also sort of invited them in because I think it'll be a big plus if they can be part of the very early engineering phase, because it is. I think there are many sort of low-hanging fruits to reap in terms of soft water biodiversity. Making sure does it need to have a few more kinks or whatever to create these spaces for the biodiversity. So I think you're right. We should label it, and we should have the ambition to make this a nature plus or environmental plus project.
I think there's also a role for governments to play as well. So what we've seen in Netherlands, there's the current tender for seabed, for the whole project, with a really clear focus on ecological innovation. So there's definitely a role for governments to play instead of just having these quantitative only seabed processes, to actually ask developers to bring the innovations that they're after, and then ensure that the biodiversity is being looked at from the very beginning.
Thank you for that.
Thanks. I'm Joachim from CIP, so I'm actually working for Thomas. So this is not necessarily a question for Thomas, but maybe to the broader panel. So in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, we have seen this sort of a race between the countries. Who builds the first island? And Denmark posted, or CIP posted that Denmark could have the first island, but we were actually overrun by the Belgium island right now. So how do we ensure that the race on building the first energy islands in the world actually becomes a global race and not just a Northern European race?
Yeah, I mean, I think competition is good, right? But it needs to be competition for the right reasons. Just being first for the sake of being first, I don't think is what we're after. What we're trying to do is just to accelerate, right? And hopefully the competition allows people to run faster to get there. So to me, the competition is a little bit of a moot point, although there may be some national pride in some of this for both these countries as an example. But I absolutely agree that we need to look at further markets, right? We need to look at, we talked earlier about Asia potentially as a market where some of this stuff can happen and in other markets. So I don't think it needs to be confined to Europe, but you know, some of these things take a long time to fruition. This has not been thought about in the last 2 years. People have been thinking about it for a long time, so we need other countries to also start to think about this, or other regions cross-country to start to think about this.
Okay, I would like to, I think that's all the questions we have time for. I'd like to hand back actually now to Joachim, who gives out the final word from the Commission. Joachim, are you there?
I am, yeah. And I did follow that discussion with really a lot of interest. I think lots of interesting points there. And really just very briefly, by way of conclusion from my side, perhaps first in reaction to the last question which was put forward about, you know, how can we make sure that this becomes a truly pan-European endeavor. Perhaps there's one element that hasn't been mentioned yet that I would like to add, because there is a sort of real technology development still to be done, and that is all around floating wind farms basically. I mean, again, the technology exists, but I think it's totally crucial that the technology makes the final step, let's say, towards full commercial availability, because that is the technology that is going to unlock, let's say, the potential in Southern Europe, simply because of the geography there. So I think that's the one technology technology side development, I think, which we would hope to see advance, and which is actually advancing. I think indeed the crucial thing here is about the timeline, right? I think we basically know how to solve the main problems, or the industry does. I mean, I think we've seen from the discussion that we do have the answers. I think the key question is how can we get these projects off the ground in the timeline that we need, and 10 years really is too long. I mean, that we can't afford. I think the one element that perhaps hasn't been stressed that much in the discussion is on the supply chain, because what we see is that there are some serious, let's say, bottlenecks which will emerge if we really want to accelerate in the way that we will accelerate. I mean, for example, with offshore cables, I think that is a big constraint, and again, I think the island concept will help to economize, but I think we also need to do everything we can to upscale our supply chain there where it's not yet sufficient, and there are some constraints. And the last point I would like to come back to, I mean, which is the one closest perhaps to our hearts as policymakers in the Commission DG Energy, and us also in particular working on networks. I do think it's crucial that we continue to push for, let's say, an integrated development of the networks, not only offshore but also onshore, which will allow to actually integrate all that capacity into the grids and bring them to the demand centers, because they are often far away. And I think if we don't accelerate also the necessary development of the onshore grids, then all this offshore development is actually going to accelerate, is actually going to aggravate the bottlenecks that we have in our system today. And that is something that partially can be addressed through power to X, I agree, it's part of the solution. But not only, I mean, electrification is going to be the, let's say, I think the first order of the day,
and that means that we need to accelerate the pace in which we adapt really the whole, I would say, topology of our electricity grids in Europe. I think that's what I wanted to say about the conclusion. Thanks very much. I found the discussion very interesting.
Yes, thank you very much for that intervention, Joachim. We appreciate your time. So that concludes the session today. On behalf of the Global Wind Energy Council, we'd like to thank you for those in the room and for all of you watching online, and particularly to our panelists, Joachim, Thomas, Elke and Alexander. Thank you very much for the time today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session tomorrow. Thank you very much.